During the Cold War, borders were never just lines on a map. They were pressure points where intelligence agencies tested each other's limits. Any unusual activity near a border was treated as a potential prelude to something larger. For the KGB, border regions were among the most closely monitored areas in the Soviet security system. In the late 1970s, Soviet counterintelligence began noticing a pattern that did not fit routine American behavior. It was not a single incident, but a series of small, disconnected signals. Increased movement of American personnel near specific border zones. Unusual logistical preparations that exceeded the needs of normal patrols. Communications traffic that appeared fragmented but persistent. Individually, these signals meant nothing. Together, they suggested preparation. The CIA had long understood that border regions offered unique opportunities. Surveillance equipment could be tested under real conditions. Communication methods could be rehearsed. Psychological pressure could be applied without direct confrontation. Any operation conducted close to a border allowed plausible deniability. If discovered, it could be dismissed as routine military or intelligence activity. The KGB's first conclusion was cautious. This was not an invasion plan. It did not resemble troop buildup or strategic deployment. Instead, it looked like an intelligence operation designed to probe Soviet response times and detection thresholds. The question was not what the CIA planned to do, but what it wanted the USSR to notice. Soviet counterintelligence activated a quiet monitoring phase. Border units were instructed not to escalate or react visibly. Surveillance assets were repositioned. Analysts were ordered to track changes rather than incidents. The goal was to understand whether the activity followed a schedule, responded to Soviet observation, or adjusted dynamically. What made the situation dangerous was timing. The Cold War at this stage was unstable. Trust between the superpowers was minimal. Any misinterpretation near a border could trigger rapid escalation. The KGB understood that. Intelligence operations conducted under these conditions were not merely about information. They were tests of nerve. As weeks passed, the pattern sharpened. Certain American movements stopped abruptly after Soviet units altered patrol routes. Communication spikes coincided with Soviet radar activity. This suggested that the CIA was actively measuring Soviet detection capabilities in real time. The operation was not passive. It was interactive. For the KGB, this crossed a critical threshold. Interactive intelligence operations near a border risked creating feedback loops. Each side reacted to the other's reaction, amplifying tension without clear intent. History had shown how quickly such loops could spiral out of control. Internally, debates intensified. Some officers argued for disruption. Others insisted on continued observation. Premature interference could expose Soviet methods. Silence, however, allowed the CIA to refine its understanding. The KGB chose restraint. Rather than confronting the operation directly, Soviet counterintelligence began shaping what the CIA would see. Patrol patterns were subtly altered. False indicators were introduced. Certain responses were delayed intentionally, others accelerated. The objective was no longer detection, but manipulation of perception. The CIA believed it was testing Soviet defenses. In reality, the Soviet Union was testing how the CIA interpreted incomplete information. By the time American analysts began to suspect that their operation was no longer producing reliable data, the KGB had already reached a conclusion. This was not reconnaissance for war. It was preparation for something quieter, more surgical, and potentially more destabilizing. The USSR had uncovered the outlines of a secret CIA operation near its border, but exposing it publicly would achieve nothing. The real question was how to end it without confirming its value, and that decision would define what happened next. As the operation unfolded near the border, the KGB shifted from observation to analysis. The key question was no longer whether the CIA was active, but why it had chosen that specific region and that specific pattern of behavior. Soviet analysts understood that intelligence agencies rarely wasted effort. Every movement was designed to extract a reaction. What concerned the KGB most was the absence of a clear objective. The activity did not align with preparations for sabotage, infiltration, or conventional espionage. There were no signs of agent insertion, no attempts to establish contact networks, and no detectable effort to move personnel across the border. This absence was itself meaningful. It suggested the operation's purpose was diagnostic rather than operational. Inside Soviet counterintelligence, a hypothesis began to form. The CIA was not preparing an action, it was rehearsing one. The border activity appeared designed to simulate the early stages of a future operation, allowing American analysts to measure Soviet response without crossing a point of no return. It was a form of intelligence rehearsal conducted under real-world conditions. Such rehearsals were dangerous. They blurred the line between testing and provocation. If either side misread intent, a simulated scenario could trigger a real response. The KGB had seen this logic before. Military exercises had escalated into crises. Signals meant to intimidate had been interpreted as preparation for attack. Border regions amplified these risks. To confirm its assessment, the KGB introduced controlled distortions. Certain detection systems were temporarily recalibrated. Patrols were redirected along less predictable routes. Communications protocols were altered slightly to test whether American activity adapted in response. The results were immediate. CIA-linked movements shifted within hours, indicating active monitoring and adjustment. This confirmed that the operation relied on feedback. The CIA was learning by watching how the Soviet system reacted to pressure. That meant the KGB could influence what the CIA learned. Soviet counterintelligence began shaping the environment more deliberately. False patterns were introduced. Routine procedures were exaggerated. In some cases, responses were delayed just long enough to suggest inefficiency where none existed. The goal was subtle deception, not to hide capability, but to misrepresent it. At the same time, the KGB took steps to compartmentalize knowledge of the operation. Border units were kept deliberately uninformed. Only a small group of analysts and senior officers had the full picture. This reduced the risk of accidental escalation. It also prevented predictable human reactions that could reveal true intentions. Internally, debates continued. Some officers argued that the CIA's behavior indicated preparation for a future intelligence breach under the cover of routine border activity. Others believed it was purely analytical, a way to test Soviet readiness during a period of heightened tension. Both interpretations carried risk. What unified these views was a shared conclusion. Allowing the operation to continue unchecked would gradually reveal too much. Even false data, if consistent, could be filtered out over time. The KGB needed to end the operation, but in a way that did not confirm its significance. Direct confrontation was rejected. Diplomatic protest would only validate American interest in the region. Increased visibility would signal success. Arrests or public exposure were unnecessary and potentially destabilizing. Instead, the KGB chose erosion. Soviet responses became increasingly inconsistent. Some signals disappeared entirely. Others appeared without explanation. The border environment lost its analytical clarity. For the CIA, the data stream became noisy, contradictory, and unreliable. Models that once produced clean correlations now failed to converge. This was intentional. Within weeks, American analysts began questioning the operation's value. The environment no longer behaved predictably. Results could not be replicated. Assumptions collapsed. The operation, designed to clarify Soviet behavior, was now obscuring it. From the outside, nothing changed. No incidents were reported. No alarms were raised. Border life continued as normal. But the intelligence battle had shifted decisively. The KGB had confirmed the existence of a secret CIA operation near its border. More importantly, it had learned how to dismantle it without confrontation, by denying it coherence. The CIA believed it was probing Soviet defenses. In reality, it was being taught a lesson about uncertainty. And the next phase of that lesson would be far more deliberate. As the border operation lost clarity, the CIA faced a growing internal dilemma. The data no longer aligned. Signals contradicted previous patterns, timelines drifted, and correlations collapsed under scrutiny. What had once appeared to be a controlled intelligence environment now behaved erratically. For analysts trained to trust consistency, this was a warning sign. Inside the CIA, some suspected increased Soviet countermeasures. Others argued the operation itself had been flawed from the start. A more troubling possibility slowly emerged. The KGB was no longer reacting, it was shaping the reaction. If true, this meant the operation had crossed a dangerous threshold. Instead of observing Soviet behavior, American intelligence might be studying a reflection designed for it. The KGB understood this psychological vulnerability well. Soviet counterintelligence doctrine emphasized one principle above all others: deny the enemy reliable interpretation. Rather than hide activity completely, it was often more effective to introduce controlled inconsistency. Humans and systems alike struggled with environments that refused to behave logically. To deepen this effect, the KGB escalated its deception carefully. Some border patrols began following exaggerated routines, visible enough to be noticed but inconsistent enough to defy modeling. Communications traffic was altered to mimic internal confusion. Equipment tests were conducted at irregular intervals, suggesting technical instability where none existed. These actions were not random. Each was designed to undermine analytical confidence. The CIA responded by increasing data collection, more sensors, more reports, more cross-referencing. But volume did not restore clarity. Instead, it amplified uncertainty. Competing analytical teams reached different conclusions based on the same information. Consensus dissolved. Without a stable baseline, the operation could no longer justify its cost or risk. This was precisely the outcome the KGB intended. Soviet counterintelligence had no need to expose the operation publicly. Exposure would end the experiment, allowing the CIA to continue. Operating in a distorted environment yielded more insight. By watching how American analysts reacted to uncertainty, the KGB learned how the CIA handled ambiguity under pressure. Internally, the KGB documented these reactions meticulously. How long did American activity persist without confirmation? When did caution replace confidence? At what point did analysts begin to doubt their own assumptions? These questions mattered more than stopping the operation outright. At the same time, the KGB took steps to ensure that the situation could not spiral out of control. Military units near the border were instructed to avoid aggressive postures. No visible escalation was permitted. The deception remained purely informational. The goal was to confuse, not provoke. As months passed, the CIA quietly scaled back the operation. Officially, it was a reassessment. Unofficially, it was an admission that the intelligence environment had become unreliable. The risk of misinterpretation now outweighed potential gains. Border regions were inherently volatile. Adding uncertainty to that volatility was unacceptable. For the KGB, this withdrawal confirmed success. The operation had been identified, analyzed, and neutralized without a single public incident. More importantly, it had reinforced a core Soviet belief. Intelligence battles were often won by patience rather than action. The CIA had approached the border expecting to measure Soviet reactions. Instead, it had been measured itself. Its assumptions, thresholds, and tolerance for ambiguity had been tested under real conditions. By the time American activity ceased, the KGB had already archived the case, not as a confrontation, but as a demonstration that intelligence operations near borders did not require force to fail. They only required uncertainty. What remained was a lesson both sides would remember. Borders were not only physical boundaries, they were psychological ones, and crossing them without understanding how the other side interpreted ambiguity could turn observation into vulnerability. The KGB had uncovered the secret CIA operation, but its greatest success was not ending it. It was ensuring that it could never be fully understood. With the CIA operation near the border effectively collapsing, the KGB shifted its focus from counteraction to containment of consequences. Ending the activity was only part of the task. The more delicate challenge was ensuring that no residual signals could be misinterpreted as weakness or escalation. In intelligence work, how an operation ends often matters more than how it begins. Soviet counterintelligence conducted a quiet normalization phase. Border routines were gradually returned to standard patterns, but not abruptly. Sudden stability could itself raise suspicion. Instead, consistency was reintroduced slowly, allowing the intelligence environment to settle without drawing attention. The objective was to erase the analytical footprint the operation had created. Internally, the KGB reviewed the case in detail. Analysts reconstructed the sequence from first detection to final withdrawal. They identified which Soviet actions had accelerated CIA doubt and which had risked overexposure. The conclusion was clear. Uncertainty had been the decisive factor. The CIA had not been forced out. It had withdrawn because it could no longer trust its own interpretations. This realization had broader implications. Border regions, the KGB concluded, were uniquely suited for this type of counterintelligence defense. They amplified ambiguity. Signals overlapped with routine military activity. Civilian and security movements intermingled. In such environments, even advanced intelligence systems struggled to separate noise from intent. The case also reinforced Soviet skepticism toward intelligence. Rehearsals, any operation designed to test reactions without committing to action carried inherent risk. Reactions were shaped by perception, not intention. Once perception diverged, control was lost. The CIA had learned this the hard way. Within the KGB, the operation was classified not as a victory, but as a warning. It demonstrated how easily intelligence experimentation could destabilize sensitive regions. Even without hostile intent, analytical probing could create feedback loops that escalated tension. The absence of clear objectives made such operations especially dangerous. Meanwhile, the CIA's internal assessments grew more cautious. Border-based intelligence activity was reevaluated across multiple theaters. Analysts noted that environments with high ambiguity reduced the reliability of behavioral modeling. The Soviet response near the border became a case study, though not one openly acknowledged. Neither side publicly referred to the incident. No diplomatic channels were engaged. No statements were made. Official silence preserved plausible deniability for both governments. But internally, the lesson was absorbed. Intelligence operations near borders required not just technical superiority, but deep understanding of how the other side interpreted uncertainty. For the KGB, the episode reaffirmed a strategic preference. Counterintelligence did not need to expose every threat. Sometimes it was more effective to let the threat exhaust itself. By denying coherence rather than access, the system protected itself without escalation. As years passed, the border returned to routine status. New officers replaced old ones. Equipment changed. Political conditions shifted. Yet the case remained in KGB archives as an example of restraint under pressure. It showed that strength did not always require visibility, and success did not always require confrontation. The CIA had prepared a secret operation near the border to learn how the Soviet system behaved. What it learned instead was how that system managed uncertainty. The KGB had not reacted aggressively, nor had it retreated. It had remained patient, adaptive, and deliberately unclear. And in doing so, it had transformed a potential intelligence advantage into a liability. What remained was one final question. Why had the KGB chosen such restraint, when exposure might have brought immediate political leverage? The answer lay not in the border itself, but in what the Soviet leadership feared most: miscalculation. That fear would shape the final stage of the story. The decision not to expose the CIA operation publicly was shaped by a single overriding concern: miscalculation. Soviet leadership understood that intelligence work near borders existed on a knife edge. A single misunderstood signal, a single overreaction, could transform an intelligence rehearsal into a political or military crisis. The KGB's restraint was not weakness, it was control. Internally, the operation was classified as successfully neutralized, not because the CIA had been forced to retreat under pressure, but because its objectives had become unattainable. The border environment had been rendered analytically hostile. Signals could no longer be trusted. Reactions could no longer be modeled. The operation had lost its purpose without ever being confronted. This outcome aligned with a broader Soviet counterintelligence philosophy. Exposure created headlines. Silence created uncertainty. By allowing the CIA to withdraw on its own, the USSR avoided escalation while denying the United States any confirmation that its operation had been understood. The absence of reaction preserved strategic ambiguity. For the CIA, the episode became a quiet lesson. Border regions, once seen as controlled laboratories for intelligence testing, were reclassified as high-risk zones for analytical distortion. The operation near the border had demonstrated how easily assumptions could collapse when the opposing side refused to behave predictably. Intelligence depended not only on collection, but on interpretation, and interpretation could be manipulated. Neither side documented the incident publicly. No archive was built for historians. No official account acknowledged what had occurred. The operation vanished into classified assessments and internal doctrine. Its influence survived not as a story, but as a shift in behavior. The KGB, for its part, archived the case as an example of defensive success through restraint. It showed that not every threat required confrontation, and not every intelligence victory required proof. By shaping perception rather than events, Soviet counterintelligence had protected the border without triggering alarm. The deeper lesson extended beyond one operation. It revealed the limits of intelligence power. Even the most advanced systems could be undermined by uncertainty. Even carefully designed operations could fail if the environment refused to behave logically. The CIA had sought clarity. The KGB had provided ambiguity. In the years that followed, similar operations were approached with greater caution on both sides. Borders remained sensitive zones, not just geographically but psychologically. They magnified fear, expectation, and error. Intelligence agencies learned that probing such spaces carried risks that could not always be measured or controlled. The KGB had uncovered a secret operation, but its greatest achievement was not detection. It was restraint. By choosing not to expose, not to escalate, and not to react visibly, the Soviet Union avoided turning intelligence curiosity into crisis. In the Cold War, victory was often defined by what did not happen. No incident, no escalation, no irreversible mistake. This operation belonged to that category. It was a battle fought in perception rather than action, and it ended without a sound. That was the point. Если нужно дальше.